Okay, we're going to call to order at this point the Human Services Background Study Eligibility Task Force. And today's Friday, March 25th. Mr. Vogel, can you please do a formal roll call, please?
Certainly, Mr. Chair. Senator Champion. Senator Champion.
I'm here on behalf of Senator Champion. I'm his legislative assistant. Sorry, I couldn't put it in the chat.
Oh, no worries, and thank you, Ms. Bogan. Or Bogan, sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. Ms. Dawson.
Present.
Mr. Esme.
Present.
Ms. Evans.
Present.
Mr. Geffen.
Here.
Mr. Hanson.
Present.
Ms. Huntley.
Present.
Mr. Urban.
Present.
Ms. Kaser. Ms. Kaser. Mr. Cameron.
Present.
Lieutenant Knotts. Thank you, Mr. Cameron. Lieutenant Knotts.
Present.
Thank you. Judge Kulik. Judge Kulik. Senator Matthews. Senator Matthews. Ms. Matson. Ms. Matson. Representative Mueller. Representative Mueller. Inspector General Modi. Inspector General Modi.
Well, this is Chris Semple at DHS. I'm standing in for Inspector General Modi today.
Thank you, Mr. Semple. And apologies, members, if I'm now going a little fast. I feel like I'm blurting all these names out. Mr. Page.
Present.
Ms. Robertus.
Present.
Thank you. Representative Robbins. Representative Robbins. Mr. Sandoval. Mr. Sandoval. Judge Satterback.
Present.
Thank you. Ms. Sherlock.
Present.
Mr. Tatum. Mr. Tatum. Ms. Williamson.
Present.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, 14 of the 24 members are present. A quorum is present.
Thank you, Mr. Vogel. Our last meeting was March 11th, and the meeting minutes have been posted on the task force website, and we want to open it up to any comments, corrections, or any issues with meeting minutes posted. I do not see any objections, and will now note, and for the record, that the meetings are approved as distributed. I think what we're going to talk about today first is kind of moving forward. As the group knows, we have three subcommittees: disqualification subcommittee, a remedy subcommittee, and a data subcommittee. The data subcommittee has been doing really good and helpful work along with the Department of Human Services to gather data on disqualifications in many areas where we've asked for information. We've received 3 data sets so far and waiting on the 4th data set. 4th data set is more focused on the reconsideration process, as I understand it, but we have a lot of data so far. The 3rd data set I thought was very helpful, but it is about 70 pages, and understanding that each member has a lot of other work, and some people with maybe limited understanding of just sifting through data. What we're doing at this point is shifting some of the data subgroups workload to a focused analysis of the data it received. So now we have the data. What does the data tell us? And what we're kind of moving for and looking for now are some ideas, thoughts, and suggestions for items that the data group should be analyzing. I think in the disqualification subcommittee, we started talking about some ideas on what we wanted to see. For example, what offenses or convictions are most prevalent in disqualifications? Where are we seeing most of that? How many? What's the percentage of cases that are non-convictions? but just focusing on the data and asking for some help. So we don't have 50 people digging through hundreds and hundreds of pages, but tasking the data subgroup with that. Chair Williamson, do you think that's a fair assessment of sort of what we had discussed trying to move forward? I certainly want to, I mean, your group does this work and I don't want to speak for it, but do you feel like that's a fair assessment?
Thank you, Chair Geffen and members of the task force. Yes, I do feel that is a fair assessment. I do want to just add that I'm just very grateful for all of the hard work that has gone into the subcommittee, especially with Member Camera and Vice Chair formulating some pie charts that some have been presented in this space as well. And yes, we are looking to go forward with the analyzing as well as synthesizing the information that we have. And we're also looking so that we can really focus in with the laser sharp focus of additional information that we need or that will be helpful in regards to as we're preparing to create the recommendations for the task force. So thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much, Chair Williamson. And I think one of the ideas behind it too is we started with the interim report with some really broad ideas of possible recommendations and changes. And I think any recommendation that's brought to the legislature and goes through this committee should be backed by data. So specifically, if your subcommittee is focusing on a recommendation, it should be tasking the data subcommittee to provide information in terms of data that supports that request. And so I'm not going to, for example, speak for the remedies subgroup, but obviously if remedies is going to make some suggestions, we want remedies to have data to support it. And Mr. Vogel, during our and this was a pretty brief discussion in our first disqualification group on this issue, we came up with some kind of general ideas. Would you be willing to kind of share just some examples of these data requests?
Certainly, Mr. Chair. And in fact, if you don't mind, I can share my screen. I've typed up those general ideas as a document for the data subcommittee. You should be able to see it.
Please and thank you.
Yeah. So I would say the general theme that I heard in the disqualification subcommittee meeting earlier this week was essentially what you were just saying, shockingly enough, since you're the chair of that subcommittee as well. But a general theme of translating this 70-some pages of data from the third data set, plus the other two, into coherent narratives. And specifically, for the purposes of the disqualification subcommittee, narratives about the list of crimes or conduct, and essentially which of those are the most prevalent, which evidentiary standards are the most prevalent to make a disqualification determination, and sort of an eye towards assessing risk of harm from the data and what rational risk of harm basis there is for the list of crimes and conduct. So, as I think you briefly already mentioned, the subcommittee was interested in hearing what the most prevalent crimes or conduct that led to a disqualification were, and then likewise what evidentiary standards were used to make those determinations. You also expressed some interest in essentially having the data subcommittee categorize the crimes or conduct that had led to disqualifications, and potentially coming up with its own categories, but defining categories or using categories derived from statute, but in either case dividing crimes up, say, into drug-related crimes, property crimes, violent crimes, that sort of thing, which I took to be getting to the theme of risk of harm and the rational risk of harm basis for these disqualifications. And then I don't know if this part of the discussion quite fits with the 3 data sets that we've received so far, but essentially questions about the variance or set aside process. And some members expressed an interest, for example, in in seeing what percentage of disqualifications for particular crimes received a set aside or variance ultimately, which again sort of gets to that rational risk of harm basis theme, because that would be a question of, I would assume, where the department essentially didn't see a compelling risk of harm. So that's basically an hour summed up very briefly. So please correct me, anyone who was there, if you feel like I'm misrepresenting your views. But yeah, that's what I've got. Oh, and I see Ms. Evans has raised her hand. I'm sorry.
No, you guys finish up this kind of
Gotcha.
part of the conversation, and I have like an extension of this that I just want to talk about in addition. So
Okay. Well, we'll get to you in just a second, Ms. Evans. And I think that you can tell from the presentation of Ms. Fogel, this is pretty early on in figuring out the exact language that's going to go to the data subcommittee. I think we want to be respectful to the data subcommittee to get it something really focused, coherent, and clear. And I think the next task is, and for each subcommittee, not data, but remedies and disqualification, to come up with its kind of comprehensive list at this time of those requests for the data subcommittee. And then by the next full meeting of this group to present it, because I want all of these questions and all these requests to leave the subgroups or the subcommittees and go to the group as a whole to see if we can add things, clarify things, and also give the data subcommittee group an opportunity to ask questions to each subcommittee to make sure we're all on the same page. So Mr. Vogel, when's our next full meeting? I can't add 14 days unless you can't ask me to add it to a month.
So, I mean, Mr. Chair, I'm looking at a calendar right now. It's May 8th.
May 8th. What's that?
I'm sorry, Mr. Chair. It's April 8th.
Okay.
I'm just skipping April.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind it. So we're gonna on the 8th. Someone from each subcommittee will present in some fashion. It doesn't have to be complete, but its request to the data subcommittee. Talk about it, why it wants the data, what it expects from the data, and just giving the data subgroup some clear instructions on what it's looking for. And certainly today, maybe, do you think, Ms. Evans, this is a good time for you to add whatever you have to add, or?
I think it is. And
okay,
I just want to make an observation, because I am starting to dig down into this data myself. And one of the things that I did, and here's me digging down into data, which, right, because I don't have any idea what I'm doing, like real talk, right? Hashtag real talk. And so one of the patterns that I noticed in this data is that across the board, females versus males on drug crimes is that women get disqualified at higher rates than men for drug crimes across the board. First degree to fifth degree possession, however they do it, for 15-year, 10-year, 7-year. Females for the same crimes get disqualified at higher rates. I even, Roy, you'd be so proud of me, made a chart. And so I'm not done with it, so I'm not going to show you, but I made a bar chart to show that they just get disqualified at higher rates. So then I went to the Department of Corrections to look, and this is data that I've already been looking at and I'm a little bit shocked by, but women are incarcerated at higher rates at the Department of Corrections for drug crimes. And so looking at all this data, I don't feel equipped to do this kind of like data analysis. And I don't know that anybody on the data team is. And so I'm just making an observation and wondering, like, what are we supposed to do with that? And so I'm just that's all I got.
Okay, let's open that up. That's a big question. Yeah, Miss Robertus.
I've shared this with the data team too a little bit, but this is where I sort of struggle a tad with the task that's before us all, right? Because I think for me, the scope of this could be extremely large and incorporate agencies and systems that go beyond this group. Like for what Gina talked about, really, that's a systemic issue that is pretty significant, right? And we see that also with Black and brown bodies too, right? And so it's a male female issue. It also impacts BIPOC communities, and that also influences us significantly. So for me, sometimes I sit here and I go, this is really broad. And if we stay so broad, are we not going to get any work done? Or do we try to start to narrow and figure out things that we can go forth and make change with? And so this is sort of where I sit. Like, it's like, where is our influence? Where's our scope? And I continue to like ask myself that, and they all influence each other. I fully recognize that. And I'm not saying that's okay either, but this is where I sit here and like, John, you said, this is a really big question and it impacts us. But where do we go with it? I don't know if I'm making any darn sense at this point, but.
Well, I think as always, you make a lot of sense. And let's keep on that discussion. Does anybody else have any thoughts on that? Because there are, I mean, I would say there are some things there's no scenario that we resolve some things here. And whether or not we just go along the course of identifying that there are pieces to this that are systemic and significantly more broad than this group can really address. And maybe that's the answer, is we say, here are some concerns. We don't have the expertise or to move forward, but somebody should be looking at this. And here's some of the stuff that we did feel we could look at. Because I do think there is stuff this group has a lot of intelligence and knowledge, lived experience. We're pretty awesome. We can figure out some of this, but there is a bunch of stuff. I agree, 100%. Mr. Sandoval, please.
Can you guys hear me? Excellent. Yeah, just to piggyback, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. And I would just say to everybody, if anybody has any resources in regards to translating some of this data, everyone could, take a part in that, of trying to find, maybe some resources to help us with it. And I mean, really, other than that, it's just digging in, and there's nowhere to go but forward and go through it, So, let's just give it our best swing and try to make it, as presentable as possible, and just do it.
I appreciate that very much, Mr. Sandoval. Anybody else want to tackle this important, difficult issue? I mean, and I agree, a lot of this is now falling on data, and I mean, the data subcommittee must just be looking with laser beams at me right now saying, how are we supposed to do it all? But I think Mr. Sandoval's comments are right, that let's do the best we can with what we have and dig in and try and identify those things that we can't do, and then continue to focus on what we can. Because I could imagine data coming back and saying, you asked for this, we don't know. And I think that's a pretty good answer, and saying, okay, we don't know.
Tashonda and Miss Williamson and Miss Matson both have their hand up. I don't know if you can see that or not.
I cannot, but I'm going to work on changing it so I can see. Thank you so much. I see Miss Matson's hand, and then we'll go to Miss Williamson.
Yeah, Miss Williamson had her hand up first.
Appreciate that. I don't even see it. So Miss Williamson, please.
Chair, thank you. And Member Matson, if you could please go before me, because I more so just wanted to kind of summarize what we've heard already.
Yes, ma'am. Chair, and when I'm sorry, I'll turn my video on. As I think about the data, I agree, it's very overwhelming, but I think to try to break data down, what I look at is comparisons to ourselves. So how the trend line has moved from year to year and what stands out, and then making comparisons to other similar entities, which is why I've been so curious about, what's happening in other states, because that's a comparative data point to say, we're likely not that dissimilar from other states. So if something stands out, significantly. Why is that? And maybe we don't necessarily have the answers for it, but could point out that this is a significant data point that is worth exploring because it doesn't compare equally, from different states. But I think having comparative data is helpful. What we have right now is just data that we can compare ourselves to. So those trend lines, which, we've got a lot that we've already kind of looked at to say, this is weird. This is, bears further eyes on it, which I also think is why we're coming to the full committee, because as the data committee, there's only a few of us there. We're saying, we want to have the entire committee look at these data points to say, what are you seeing before we're drawing conclusions or assumptions with our own personal bias. So that's all I wanted to say.
And I do want to add, one of the difficult things that we're experiencing is when you look at other states, it's just not apples to apples. Every state has a very different group that they regulate, how they regulate. And so it's a little, I think you can look at the laws and say, okay, this is really different. The other thing we don't have is the access that we have to the Department of Human Services here in Minnesota at the table giving us the data. So I think it would be great if we had everybody's data from the Midwest in the depth and structure that we have from Minnesota. I just don't know if we're going to get it.
Chair Geffen, one of my points with that is the outcome, right? We're trying to prevent harm from occurring in certain settings. So there is statistical data about what abuse and neglect issues occur, say, in our setting. As a comparison point to say, if that's what you're trying to prevent by excluding certain individuals, I get that the processes might be different, but how is it different based on outcome? Based on what the intent is with a background study is to limit people that are working in certain settings to prevent abuse and neglect. So I guess that was the data point that I was going to for comparisons in my mind.
And obviously I'm not part of the data subcommittee. Has the data subcommittee sought that data from other states?
I don't know.
Okay. Maybe that's
it's something that we've talked about, but I would have to phone a friend.
Well, you've got a friend, so and that maybe is a good segue to Ms. Williamson. Ms. Williamson, I don't want to add to your list, but if there is any information you have on that, that'd be great.
Yes, so I appreciate all that has been said, and I just wanted to let the task force know that since the very first data subcommittee meeting, it's been an intent of getting to this point, even though we were originally just gathering the data. We have been studious, if you will, to prepare, right? So that once we are able to, once we have all of the data and we have all that evidence, right, being able to apply it or have it to support recommendations. And so in regards to the state-by-state comparison, I know that I believe it was Remedies, and Mr. Vogel, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that Mr. Vogel was already doing a state-by-state comparison that we've asked him to, he's referenced to or made mention of in our subcommittee meetings as we were looking at that as a focus. I also want to make mention that we have submitted a formal request to DHS in regards to someone from their data team, either being able or more of a both and to attend one of our subcommittee meetings, just to assist in regards to either the interpretation or just being there to answer some specific questions, in addition to preparing a presentation to present before the full task force. So I do want to let members know that has been in the works here for a few months as far as that request. And we're just waiting to hear back as far as when that date has happened, because DHS has expressed with staff shortages that's somewhat somewhat a daunting task for them. I also want to make mention that we have already been looking at data, not just with DHS, but from external areas as well. We also have been we have meetings coming up for a presentation from experts in different fields. So this is, the work is going on. And lastly, I want to say, when we're looking at whether we're focusing on cause and effect to identify, or we're looking to illustrate, or given like chronological order and looking to define by comparison or contrast or problem and solution, whichever focus or path that we go down, I do just want to say that it's very disappointing that when it comes to the disparities in regards to racial reform, or whether it's gender, whether it's brown and Black bodies, that it's such a huge, significant problem that oftentimes it's not taken on. And it would behoove this task force not to feel overwhelmed at this task, but that we can systematically go forward to be able to bring tangibles to this problem that has been here for centuries. So thank you, Chair Geffen.
Well, thank you, Ms. Williamson, and I appreciate your comments. And I wanted to say, I really agree that all the subcommittees are working hard on a big problem. And I feel, at least personally, that there are times like the problem feels so big. And then other times I feel like if we look at smaller pieces, we can start eroding some of the problems with it. And I think if we keep that in mind, we can benefit from each other's strength and knowledge and just keep plugging away. I did want to ask, and I'm sorry, Mr. Zimpel, that I know you aren't DHS as an entity, but if you had any updates on when we might see the fourth data set come in, because obviously data is needed to come up to support recommendations, and maybe you guys have talked about this, but I forget, and whether or not somebody is going to be available to the data subcommittee to help explain some of that, as Ms. Williams said, any updates that you have on that, even though that might not really be on your plate.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. Chris Zimpel at DHS. So we do have the fourth data set in process at the moment, and asked about it yesterday. I still think it's being put together and then it needs to go through our review. So we anticipate hopefully in the next week or so that you all would receive it. I hope I'm not speaking out of turn, and my colleagues might be cringing as they watch this. And so hopefully very soon on that front.
Great,
and regarding a presentation or staff being available, so a presentation, I'll tackle that one first. We are right in the midst of legislative session, deadlines, and so this is a really challenging time to put together a full presentation and so it's not just a staff person being available to present the material, it's doing the analysis, pulling it all together, and then being available. And so I think once we get through this busy period of session through the deadlines, I think we can revisit that request. I'd hope we'd be able to do something before the end of session. Worst case scenario, that sort of full presentation would have to wait until after the end of session. I do know that a lot of legislative task forces do pause their work during session for that very reason. And at that time, that would be after session, we'd be far more available to be more hands-on with the data subcommittee, having somebody come in, being able to talk through that. So again, it's just a really challenging time for the department to make those resources available.
And I appreciate that, and I appreciate the update. I think that is helpful to remember. It would seem at some point that'd be nice just to, and I won't, and I'll defer to Miss or Chair Williamson. Be nice to have somebody from DHS there just to be, hey, on page 47 it says this. What did that mean? But not interpret, but explain if there is a difference there. But Ms. Williamson, is that to some degree what you were hoping for too? I know that there was the presentation, but having someone there to just sort of explain, not explain intent meeting, but just explain the data.
Chair Griffin, both and we're hoping someone can help to explain as well as prepare a presentation.
Okay. Well, I'll defer to data and DHS to kind of iron that out, but I appreciate Mr. Zempel being here today and providing that information.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, and in any presentation, I know from our perspective, we would like it to be to the full task force. So being able to support the data subcommittee, come in and talk through some of that data at some point. That's one piece, but I think the actual presentation, we'd like to make sure that we make that available to the full task force membership. So we can coordinate on when that makes sense and how to do that. So.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chair, if I may,
yes,
Mr. Zempel, thank you. Mr. Zempel, thank you for that clarification. I do want to state that request was for the presentation to be prepared for the full task force.
Great. Ms. Evans.
Yeah, so it's like this catch-22 for us, right, Mr. Zempel? Because like it would be cool if we could, like, in our task force, our data task force meetings, like get down to work in analyzing and going through the data, and then have somebody there that is part of the data team from you all to be able to help us, like, ask questions and like, what is this definition? But then the person that or whatever. And so it's hard. And then we can't even really get together outside of the task force meetings because of open meeting laws, right? And so we're like stuck in this super weird spot that makes it hard to like get the work done, like, except for right here. Do you know what I mean? And so to have somebody from y'all's team be able to like help us would be really cool. And so.
Yeah, I'll be happy to bring that sentiment back to our team and talk through again what resources we can make available when. As you know very well, this is an incredibly challenging time. We have a lot of requests from the legislature. I mean, we consider ourselves a full service agency when it comes to legislative process, working hand in hand with them to understand our complex processes and how to make changes to those. And so it's
May 31st, you're saying?
Yeah, right. Hopefully we'd be able to have resources sooner, maybe during the lull after legislative break and before we get to the end of session rush, but I don't want to promise anything.
Yep.
We have to wait until then, but I'd go back and talk with the team. So
okay.
And it would seem to me like, and again, I'm going to defer to data on this, but it would be that somebody with some institutional knowledge of the data could participate in the data subcommittee just to be there to answer some of those questions in a timely manner. I think that actually frees up more time in the future, so we're not sending multiple emails explaining it. So it's really 1 hour every couple weeks. We hope that DHS can provide that because it's so important. And the other issue is we don't want to misrepresent DHS data. We got into that a little bit before, that it's important that when we're interpreting it, we get some instantaneous feedback from DHS that says, yeah, that's, an apple's an apple and an orange is an orange. I think that request seems pretty important to me. And I know, Mr. Zempel, you're not in charge of that, but I do hope you take it back to administration that we really need an hour every couple of weeks to keep this moving, because data is tough. I think it's difficult stuff to understand. All right, that's my 2 cents. Mr. Burtis, please.
for me, are you saying that, I mean, we have Emily there. It's not like we don't have DHS there. They've been there each time helping us immensely. So I'm a little confused by that because we have had people there helping us navigate some of this.
Could,
I
could
also
we,
just have
could,
it
could
as
we on
someone.
that?
Yep.
Could-
Yep. The problem with it, Jolene, is she's there, but her role is to write down whatever questions that we have and just bring it back to the data
Sure.
team. And so
That's
to have
fair.
somebody there from the data team that could maybe more quickly answer the questions that we have, like somebody there that is familiar with the data that was pulled to be able to maybe more in a more timely fashion answer the questions that we're asking. And so
Okay, so as someone who also like is a state agency, right? When I get asked some of the questions we're asking, because I'm even on that team, it does require some consultation. Some of the questions we're asking, I'm not sure, even in my role at the DOC, I would just have an answer for that committee. It requires some consultation, we can't misspeak on some of the questions that are being asked of us. So that's my first thought, that I think no matter who you put there, it's going to require some feedback from the team, make sure we're providing correct answers. That would just be my first thought as a state agency, because sometimes that happens where we're there representing a large group of people. And so we need to consult before we provide some of that information. Just a forethought. I also have a question for the committee, because I feel like we have a lot of data. We've been given a lot of data. And based on that, is there any work we can go forward with? I feel like we're spending a lot of time talking about what we need and going back and getting more and more data, but we have so much already. For me, it's starting to become a tad overwhelming. And can we take what we have? Because I know right now, if you were to ask me what I think we should prioritize, I think the length of disbarment, permanent disbarment, like these are things that I think we already have the information to support and should start to move forward with. And so for me, I feel like we're a little stuck and we keep requesting more and more data, but we have so much already. What can we do with what we already know? There's disparities, like all this is before us. And so for me, I would like to see us to start to move forward. Or does the other committees have information already before them to make some solid recommendations? Just based on the things that some of it's way beyond me. I mean, these lists are complex and I understand that, but I can see right away, there's a few things that I'm like, this should be prioritized. This seems doable. This seems like we could get bipartisan support with this. So that's just me.
And I want to say that the intent of today, and Mr. Page will get you just a moment, the intent of today and the allocation of these sort of tasks, so to speak, to data is exactly what Mr. Burtis is talking about. Transitioning from just this full gather mode to using the data we have, and we have a lot. Let's get through what we have as we wait for more, but let's start using what we have to get to the recommendations. I agree with Mr. Burtis 100%, and that's the intent, Mr. Burtis, of what we're doing now, is to move forward. So I agree 100%. We don't have everything, but we've got a lot, and let's analyze it and let's figure out how that shows what we think needs to be changed or doesn't. So that's the goal. Yeah, Mr. Page, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this is something I've been thinking about since we last met. And I was going to save it for later in the meeting, but based on what Ms. Roberta's just said, I would like to bring up that I think time is one of our more valuable resources, and I would recommend consider recommending establishing a drafting subcommittee so that we can start putting some of these ideas into written form. It's certainly where I feel most comfortable doing legislative work, is working through actual language, because everyone can bring up ideas and brainstorm and see disparities, but to actually translate that into recommended language or language to consider, I think would be one of the two really helpful things for legislators who might be reviewing this report. The other being, the conclusions we've found about the data and based on the testimony we've heard. And so I'll just put that out there as an idea to consider for the future, is creating a drafting subcommittee for folks to start working on this.
And Mr. Page, can I follow up with that? I had envisioned, and I'm not wedded to this at all, but I had envisioned the subcommittees drafting after they kind of came to some conclusion on their recommendations, getting those sort of approved by the larger group. Do you think having a group separate from the subcommittees for just drafting makes sense, or do you think that should exist within the subcommittees? That was a rather convoluted question, but if you understand it, answer it.
Mr. Chair, this is my first time on a legislative task force. I don't know if there is a common practice for how to proceed with those next steps. My only suggestion would just be that we, as someone who has gone over drafts and drafts and drafts of various pieces of legislation over the years, something this complicated and expansive will almost certainly take many months, if not years, to put together, and we don't have that amount of time. So
Sure.
I'd be open to any sort of process for how to structure the drafting of any proposed legislation, but
Okay.
I do think we
Sure.
need to start.
Sure, Geffen. So the difference between this task force and many other task forces is that it was written into the bill that we not only make recommendations, but also put forward actual legislation to be drafted. And so Max has experience drafting legislation, and it's pretty technical. And so I think it's a great idea. Once we have our recommendations, that that somebody do that with, because I don't know if you've ever done that, but it's not normal language.
And I'd like to hear from Remedies, because Mr. Page is a member of the disqualification. But Lucas or Josh and Ms. Williamson, I will get to you just a sec. I want to make sure, since I just asked for Josh or Lucas, but I'll get to you, Ms. Williamson, just a second. Yeah, Mr. Esme.
Lucas, I don't mean to jump in front of you here, but
go ahead.
So what we at our last meeting, kind of what we sort of planned to do was we had kind of identified 3 buckets or 3 areas of the sort of the remedy structure that we wanted to make changes to, and we were just going to pick one and then dive in and come to a consensus of what the change should be, and then we anticipated starting to work on language. I kind of think that whether or not we establish a 4th subcommittee, some of that work should probably stay in the remedies and disqualification subcommittees, just for the sake of not having one committee need to draft everything. But I kind of do like the idea of having, maybe the subcommittees work on coming up with what the policy recommendation is, and maybe a draft of the language, but then having there be a home for who is going to nail down the the final perfected version of the proposed statutory language. I don't know, Lucas, is there anything else from Remedies you wanted to add?
No, I think that pretty much summarizes, and I think that makes sense to sort of piggyback, I think, on what's being said. I do really like the idea, because the language is so technical, and what actually becomes the language becomes so important. But I do think, especially each group, at least starting with not only their policy, but even just starting to put the proposed language on paper, because I think what we sort of even realized with the draft last time around was, once we started putting it on paper, it definitely started to come, but you got to make that first step. But I do definitely like, and I think with Mr. Page's experience and anyone else on the subcommittee actually drafting language, I definitely think that makes sense. Maybe just not quite yet. So that's my only 2 cents.
And Mr. Vogel, I had a question whether or not we would have any kind of technical writing support from legislative staff.
Mr. Chair, I believe so, yes. But we'd obviously need concrete recommendations to be asking them about.
Could an individual from that sit on a subcommittee designed for the writing component?
Mr. Chair, I think that's going to be one of those phone a friend questions. I'm going to reach out to resources here and get back to you.
And I would propose that we not make any action on this today, but each subcommittee should be tasked with talking about this issue and coming up with a recommendation how they want to proceed with drafting any proposed legislation at the next full meeting. And I think it's a good idea, and we can figure out then if and then how we begin that and when it should begin, because it doesn't seem like we're there yet. But I want to use the people who have skills and abilities in that drafting, like Mr. Page and others, in a thoughtful way. So I think it's a great idea. Ms. Williamson, I've left you hanging for far too long. My apologies, please.
No worries, Chair Giffen. I basically what all came out was what I was going to say, that because I know with the Mr. Vogel and that team, they have made mention of being able to provide that type of assistance. I think being able to, as a full task force, I know we have the subcommittee for the subcommittees that was initially established. And so I know we're in the process of looking to, I know Data and Remedies is looking to have a meeting together to do some brainstorming. But I make mention of that just to say, I think being able to establish some deadlines throughout the rest of the year, because I know really our recommendations should really be solid no later than September, really. So I think being able to establish those deadlines, Chair, would be very beneficial.
Thank you so much, Ms. Williamson. It's such a great segue. I think we're going to have Mr. Vogel kind of talk now, and I think it's perfectly in line with what you were saying, Ms. Williamson, and what Mr. Page said. But time is an asset and one not to be squandered, and we want to make sure we're deliberate about how we use it. Mr. Vogel, can you kind of follow up with that on discussions we've had about moving forward?
Certainly, Mr. Chair. So the basic date looming is December 16th. That's when the statute that enabled this task force, that's the latest it requires the final report to be delivered. So working back from that, thinking about the technically complex issues with drafting potential legislative language, or even simply drafting language for the final report. Sorry, did I say final report at the beginning? If not, I apologize. Thinking backwards from that, and then including the fact that the full task force will need to chew over whatever comes out of the subcommittees. It's basically my recommendation that the subcommittees would want to get their work done, as Chair Williamson says, by late September at the latest, just to give enough time for the rest of the process. So that's about 6 months from now. And sorry, I'm trying to think on my feet. I hadn't thought through the possibility of a fourth subcommittee to draft language, but just ignoring that. That's essentially 6 months between now and then. As a suggestion, if the group came up, say, with one goal for each of those months, right, to discuss, you come to a consensus on some particular topic, or have some particular task accomplished, that obviously could be a sliding sort of schedule if things get done earlier or later. But that would add a little bit of structure. Essentially, the point I want to emphasize is it feels like we have endless amounts of time. We really don't at this point.
And I think things to remember. I mean, we talked earlier about we're in session, and then we're in summertime where just things change. So I think the goal, Mr. Vogel, as you and I have discussed too, is to come up with some type of set, not so much a calendar, but some timelines moving forward that we're going to try to have each subcommittee having certain things done. We're not trying to guide the subcommittee, but trying to give us some structure moving forward that we don't squander the time and have some deadlines.
Mr. Chair, if I may.
Please.
I do want to be really clear to state that in regards to Member Page's ideal about a drafting subcommittee or a fourth subcommittee, even though it's a great idea, I don't think creating an additional subcommittee would be beneficial because we already have that subcommittee of subcommittees group established. And I'm not sure if Mr. Page was a part of that initial meeting. If someone could confirm, that would be great, because then that would be a way of going forward as far as tallying together what the subcommittees have come up with.
And, you know, and I'd be frank, I don't care what we call it. I just want to get the people that have the skill in legislative writing to the table so we best achieve our goals. So I think it's a good question, whether we create something or, you know, add Mr. Page to that. It was hard to remember what we even called it, Ms. Williamson, but I know we had a name, the subcommittee to design the subcommittees. But yeah, I think I would prefer, and I like to hear from others just about, let's think about what we're trying to do, get the people who can write that type of writing in the room with the people that are explaining the goals and purpose of the recommendation. All right, so I think we're all on the same page. We just got to figure out what we call it. And I know in the legislative context, it matters what we call it, but we'll make sure that we do that. I want to open up a little bit to, well, let me ask, are there any other questions sort of about what we've discussed so far and what we're planning on doing moving forward, really just in the next month? Okay, what I want to do now is just sort of open it up. I think we had it listed, Mr. Vogel, of coming up with some timelines moving forward. It would seem to me that the timelines beyond your grand, you know, kind of like end date in September might be better suited for the subcommittees to come up with their own timelines. Could we task each subcommittee to kind of come up with their timeline of how they're going to get using deadlines to this December final deadline? I think that makes sense, but I'll defer to Lucas and Ms. Williamson. What do you guys think about that?
Chair Griffin, if I may,
please.
I think you know, because there's been an addition to the data subcommittee's work, right? In this meeting, and also some additional ideas that have come up. I think it would be helpful if you know, we're going into April here. We know session isn't over until May. That maybe with the April meetings of the subcommittees, we could all more so solidify a time frame or a schedule or deadline, however, so that when we come together again as a full task force, we could then be more prepared to provide deadlines in that manner.
And so we're thinking that kind of 22nd of the 22nd, Mr. Vogel, or am I doing my math wrong? I forget if it's the 8th or 6th for the next one.
Mr. Chair, it's the 8th and then the 22nd. So
should we say on the 22nd, each subcommittee will return with sort of its calendar?
Work plan.
I like it. Work plan. Thank you, Gina. I mean, Vice Chair. So yeah, well, why don't we task each subcommittee to come up with its work plan to get to December? And you know, it's fluid, but we want to make sure that we have a plan that gets us there as opposed to getting to August and being behind. And Mr.
Chair,
please, yes.
Excuse me again. Our plan to get to September.
Correct. How are we going to get to the finish line, and how are you going to set deadlines to get there for your task force? And then, Mr. Vogel, if you could, at the conclusion of this meeting, send out that expectation to everybody so we're on the same page for that meeting.
Certainly, Mr. Chair.
Do any of the members have any questions, concerns about that?
No, I just was gonna chime in. I think that that makes sense, and that's definitely something the remedies subcommittee can maybe put on our agenda for our next meeting.
Thank you, Ms. Dawson. And then we just want to have an open-ended discussion really about anything else that is of concern to the large group, whether it's a small issue, big issue, but want to continue to check in with the group on any issues people are having or concerns or anything. Or maybe everyone's just zoomed out and it is Friday, I think. Josh, are you raising your hand? Mr. Esme.
Yeah, I was just gonna say I don't have much to raise for further concerns, but just sort of by way of explanation on that, from our point of view in the remedies subcommittee, what we were hoping for from this meeting was kind of some marching orders, so to speak. And I think that's kind of what we covered. So
okay,
appreciate that.
And obviously, if people have issues outside of this meeting and need to communicate it, please reach out to Mr. Vogel. He is a huge and wonderful resource for all of us. So let's just make sure he doesn't have any wasted time sitting around playing Wordle. We'll get good use out of him. Anybody else have any other thing? I mean, we can certainly check out earlier today and get to work on these things. There's no reason to always use all the time we've allocated. Anybody else with any issue at all? All right, I just want to thank everybody for their ongoing efforts, and we're moving. Let's just keep moving it. Thank you all, and that will adjourn today's meeting.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Mr. Chair.